My name is Olivia, and I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. High gates, manicured lawns, crystal chandeliers, and marble floors that gleamed under the sunlight. People would say, "What a beautiful home. What a lucky girl." But luck doesn't always mean happiness. And beauty, as I quickly learned, doesn't erase loneliness. I was the middle child in a family of three children. My older sister, Vanessa, was bold, vibrant, and impossible to ignore. She had that effortless charm that drew attention like a magnet. My younger brother, Lucas, was mischievous, full of energy, and endlessly entertaining to our parents. And then there was me, quiet, observant, a shadow moving through our home. Even though we lived under the same roof, I often felt like I was in a completely different world. My parents tried, I think, to pay attention to me, but the way they loved seemed to favor Vanessa's brilliance and Lucas's antics. Every compliment from me felt measured, cautious, almost reluctant. If I did well at school, it was acknowledged briefly and then forgotten. If I spoke up at home, I was often interrupted, dismissed, or ignored. I learned early on to stay small, to fade into corners, to exist without drawing attention. I mastered the art of silence. I became invisible, not by choice, but because it was safer. Our house was enormous, with rooms I could get lost in, endless hallways lined with portraits of ancestors I barely knew, libraries filled with books I never had time to read, and dining rooms with tables so long they could seat 20 people. On the surface, everything screamed wealth, comfort, perfection. But inside, the house was full of quiet tension. The rooms were polished and bright, but the air often felt heavy, weighted with unspoken expectations and comparisons. I remember walking down the grand staircase in the mornings, the polished wood cool beneath my bare feet, listening to the echo of my own steps. Vanessa would sweep past me, laughing loudly with Lucas, already dressed for the day, already perfect. And I would adjust my sleeve, straighten my backpack, and try to appear invisible. I wanted nothing more than to be unseen, to avoid the inevitable questions, teasing, or corrections that seemed to follow me like a shadow. School became my sanctuary. At school, I wasn't the overlooked middle child. I wasn't invisible. I was Olivia, the thoughtful, capable girl who did her work well and quietly impressed her teachers. I could spend hours in the library, writing in my journal, reading books that transported me far away from my polished but suffocating home. But weekends and holidays always brought me back to reality, back to a house that could not see me. Our family dinners were the most challenging. I would sit at the long dining table, often between Vanessa and Lucas. Vanessa would dominate the conversation, regaling everyone with her stories, her laughter ringing through the high ceilings. Lucas would chime in with jokes or questions, drawing attention away from anyone else. And I learned to nod politely, offer the occasional smile, comment minimally. Speak too much, and I risked mockery. Speak too little, and I risked being overlooked. It was a delicate balance I practiced every single day. I can remember one evening when I was 12. My parents were hosting a formal dinner for some of their business associates. Vanessa had spilled wine on the carpet moments before the guests arrived. Chaos erupted. My mother scolding, my father muttering under his breath, Lucas laughing despite the seriousness of the situation. And I sat quietly at the corner of the table, quietly moving my chair slightly so I wouldn't be in anyone's way. I watched, I observed, I tried to not exist too loudly in that room. That night, I realized that being invisible wasn't just safer, it was essential. But invisibility comes at a cost. I began to understand, even then, that fading away could never fully protect me. I started keeping my thoughts to myself, not because I had nothing to say, but because no one would hear it anyway. I watched my siblings receive praise, attention, and sometimes even affection that felt out of reach to me. I envied their confidence. I envied their ability to exist in this home without fear of being overlooked. Yet, beneath my quiet exterior, I began to cultivate a small but powerful sense of awareness. I noticed everything. The way Vanessa's laugh always seemed to carry farther than it should. The way Lucas could almost charm anyone in the room. the way my parents' eyes would light up at their achievements, but only glance in my direction when convenient. I studied interactions, measured responses, memorized patterns. It was a coping mechanism, yes, but it also became a skill, a way of navigating a household where my voice was rarely valued. One afternoon, when I was 13, my father asked me to organize the guest list for an important family event. I spent hours preparing it, carefully balancing seating arrangements, dietary preferences, and timing. I took meticulous notes, cross-checked every name, and made sure every detail was perfect. When Vanessa saw it, she rolled her eyes, saying, "That's way too rigid. People will ignore your plan anyway." Lucas shrugged, unconcerned, and my parents barely glanced at it before making their own adjustments. I felt a surge of frustration and sadness. My effort had been erased before it could even be acknowledged. And yet, in that moment, a small voice inside me said something important. You cannot rely on others to see your value. You have to recognize it yourself. That evening, I began forming the first inklings of the resilience that would carry me through the years ahead. The house remained beautiful, the chandeliers sparkling, the polished floors gleaming. On the outside, it was a perfect home, but on the inside, I learned to survive by observing, by staying quiet, by finding small pockets of control and comfort where I could. I discovered the value of patience, of listening, and of cultivating an inner life rich enough to sustain me when the outside world failed to do so. And so, my story begins, not with conflict, not with rebellion, but with a quiet determination, a determination to find my own voice, to carve out a place for myself, and to navigate a family that, for all its wealth and polish, could not yet see me for who I truly was. The house I lived in was full of unspoken rules, rules my parents never explained, but that everyone seemed to know instinctively. I was 14 by the time I began to understand them, and even then only partially. Don't complain. Don't make mistakes that draw attention. Do what's expected, not what you want. Breaking these rules could mean anything from a quiet glance of disappointment from my mother to a pointed comment from Vanessa or a teasing remark from Lucas. I never knew what would be the breaking point, so I tiptoed around, speaking softly, observing, and rarely asserting myself. School became a sanctuary. At school, no one cared that I was quiet at home. No one compared me to siblings who didn't exist there. Teachers listened to me. Friends valued my opinion. I could spend hours in the library reading or writing in my journal, creating a world where I was recognized for me, not for what I lacked compared to Vanessa or Lucas. Still, weekends and holidays meant returning to the house, a place where my voice was minimal and my presence was almost optional. I would spend hours wandering through empty halls when everyone was busy with their own activities, feeling the oppressive weight of invisible walls that I could never see but constantly felt. One day, when I was 15, I made a mistake. My father had left me in charge of arranging a small family gathering, just an intimate dinner with a few friends and relatives. I spent hours planning the seating, the dishes, the little decorative touches that would make it perfect. Everything was ready when my siblings arrived. Vanessa immediately started rearranging the seats. "No one will sit here, it's too stuffy," she said with a dismissive smile. Lucas added jokes and distractions, moving the decorations I had carefully placed. By the time my parents arrived, half of my arrangements had been altered or ignored. I felt the sting of invisibility in a new, sharper way. My effort, hours of careful work, was gone. My voice had no weight in my own home. I sat quietly, suppressing tears, wondering why I even tried to be seen. That night in my room, I vowed to find a way to assert myself, not with loud confrontation, but with quiet intelligence, a way that could not be ignored. Around that same age, I began observing patterns in my family more consciously. Vanessa thrived on charm, theatrics, and attention. Lucas thrived on humor, mischief, and spontaneity. And I thrived on thoughtfulness, precision, and careful planning. I realized the family valued the first two traits over the third, but I also realized that my own strength could exist quietly as long as I found moments to exercise it strategically. I started noticing little things, how my mother's attention shifted when someone achieved something visible, how my father appreciated logic and preparation when it was presented in a way he couldn't dismiss, how Vanessa's laughter often masked insecurity. Observing all this, I began to map the unspoken rules of survival. One day, when I was 16, Lucas had a minor accident in the garden. He tripped and scraped his knee while playing with a friend. Vanessa immediately ran to get attention for him. My parents fussed and scolded and reassured him. And I stayed back. I cleaned up the leaves and dirt quietly, applied ointment without asking, made sure he was comfortable, and yet no one thanked me. I learned something crucial that day. Recognition in my family would never be given freely. If I wanted to be seen, I would have to claim it in my own way. And claiming it meant timing, planning, and strategy, not force or anger. By 16, I had begun experimenting with small victories, nothing dramatic, nothing to draw immediate attention, but enough to feel a sense of ownership over my own life. I would organize the family's weekly menus with care, leaving notes for my mother that she sometimes ignored. I would help Vanessa prepare for school events, quietly correcting details she didn't notice. I started recording small achievements in my journal, reminding myself that even if my family didn't see me, I could see myself. Despite my growing awareness and efforts, tension remained. The rifts between us siblings often went unspoken but were deeply felt. Vanessa would criticize subtly, Lucas would tease persistently, and my parents would oscillate between praise for visible accomplishments and ignoring my quieter achievements. Each day was a delicate balance of asserting myself without provoking unnecessary conflict, of surviving invisibility while inching toward recognition. Yet, in the midst of this tension, small sparks of joy existed. I would escape to my room, draw, write, or play the piano. Music and art became my sanctuary. In those hours, I was not invisible. I was not the overlooked middle child. I was Olivia, complete, whole, and valued in a way no one in the family could ignore. Those moments became essential to my survival. They were tiny victories that slowly built my confidence. I began to understand that the unspoken rules of my family were not barriers, they were challenges to navigate, challenges that would, eventually, teach me resilience, strategy, and the courage to claim my voice when the moment came. By the end of part 2, I knew something clearly. I could not depend on my family to see me. I could not rely on recognition, praise, or understanding to be given freely. I had to create it, and that realization set the stage for my first real moment of triumph, a moment that would quietly but irrevocably shift my place in the family. Turning 16 was like stepping into a different world, though I still lived in the same house. I had begun to understand the rhythms, the invisible rules, and the subtle currents that governed our family. I knew how to navigate them quietly, how to carve out spaces where I could matter without provoking conflict. The opportunity arrived unexpectedly, as it often does in life. Our family was hosting the annual charity gala, an event everyone in the city looked forward to. For most people, it was glittering dresses, sparkling chandeliers, and networking opportunities. For me, it became a battlefield, a chance to prove that I could contribute, that I could be seen for who I truly was. The preparations were exhausting. Days stretched into nights as I studied layouts, floral arrangements, and lighting plans. I measured, adjusted, and remeasured. Vanessa, of course, wanted everything to reflect her taste. Lucas mostly laughed at the chaos, teasing me with constant interruptions and jokes. One evening, while arranging candles and table settings, Vanessa came in, twirling and inspecting my work. "Olivia, you're overthinking it," she said lightly, but her eyes held something sharper. "No one will notice half of this anyway." I swallowed the irritation that threatened to rise. "Maybe not," I said quietly, "but I will, and I want it to be perfect." She rolled her eyes and left. Lucas wandered past, offering an offhand, "Good luck, little sis," which sounded teasing, but in its own way felt supportive. Night after night, I stayed late. I learned to appreciate the quiet, the way light bounced off crystal vases, how the gentle hum of the chandelier blended with soft music from the practice room downstairs. In those moments, I felt powerful, not in a loud or aggressive way, but in a quiet, deliberate sense of control. I was creating something beautiful, something that belonged to me, and I realized something important. Recognition, though rare in my family, could be earned through patience, care, and excellence. Finally, the night of the gala arrived. The grand hall gleamed with soft golden light. Guests in elegant dresses and tuxedos moved gracefully among tables that seemed to float in the glow. My heart raced as I saw people admire the arrangements, the way the flowers were aligned perfectly, the subtle lighting that highlighted the chandeliers, the way every detail seemed to breathe elegance. I overheard comments from guests. "This is exquisite. Who planned this? Absolutely stunning work." I remained in the background, blending into the crowd, waiting for recognition. And then it happened. My parents, who usually barely glanced my way, approached. My father's eyes lingered on the arrangements. "Olivia," he said slowly, "this is remarkable. You did all this?" I nodded quietly, barely able to speak, a flush rising to my cheeks. Vanessa looked on, her usual confident smirk replaced with a small, reluctant admiration. Lucas, for once, was speechless. For a brief moment, I was not invisible. For a brief moment, the house, my family, and the world acknowledged my effort and care. The small victory gave me courage. I realized that recognition wasn't just about speaking louder, being bolder, or demanding attention. It was about creating something undeniable, something that spoke for itself. I had learned to translate my quiet diligence into visible results, and in doing so, I had earned a place in the family's attention, even if only for a moment. But the victory also brought tension. Vanessa, usually unchallenged in her dominance, seemed slightly unsettled. Lucas, whose playful teasing often drew the spotlight, looked uncertain. And my parents, though impressed, subtly reminded me that the world outside the gala expected me to remain polite, composed, and reserved. Still, I understood that true acknowledgement, the kind that comes from doing something meaningful, was worth navigating the discomfort of family tension. In the weeks that followed, small changes began to ripple through the household. My opinions were asked more often, even if quietly. My parents glanced at me with something closer to respect. Vanessa's teasing became less sharp, though it lingered beneath the surface. Lucas seemed to pause before pulling pranks or making jokes at my expense. I knew these shifts were minor, almost imperceptible to anyone outside our family, but to me, they were monumental. For the first time, I felt that my actions could influence the household, that my voice, though quiet, could ripple outward. Yet, I also realized that this was only the beginning. Recognition from my family was fleeting. It could be taken back, dismissed, or overshadowed at any moment. I had to learn not only how to claim it, but how to sustain it, to build a presence that could not be ignored or erased. That realization came slowly, in private moments when I reflected on the gala. Sitting in my room, I wrote in my journal, "I am capable. I am seen. I am enough. My family may not always understand, but I can create my own moments of recognition. I do not need permission to exist fully." It was the first time I truly believed it. By the time I went to bed that night, exhausted but exhilarated, I knew that I had discovered something essential about myself. Quiet diligence, thoughtfulness, and perseverance can create moments that even the loudest voices cannot overshadow. And though the road ahead in my family was far from easy, I felt a spark of hope. A small but enduring flame that promised that one day I could carve out a place for myself, not only in my family, but in the wider world. After the gala, I thought perhaps a new chapter had begun. Perhaps my family would start seeing me differently. But life rarely works that simply. Recognition can be fleeting, and in our house, old patterns die slowly, if at all. Vanessa, for one, was noticeably unsettled by the attention I had quietly garnered. I could feel it in the way she looked at me, her smile polite but tight, her words clipped. Lucas, though mischievous as ever, seemed to sense a shift too. He no longer teased me as lightly. His pranks had an edge, as if testing whether I could still be pushed aside. And my parents were proud, yes, but their pride was cautious, tempered by the expectation that I remain quiet, obedient, and unassuming. In our house, excellence was acknowledged only if it didn't challenge the family hierarchy. It was during a particularly long Sunday afternoon that the first real confrontation occurred. Vanessa had been preparing for a school presentation, and naturally she demanded my help. I agreed, as I always did, knowing it might be the only way to maintain peace. But her tone, sharp and impatient, grated on me. "You're too slow, Olivia. Why are you always so careful?" she snapped as I tried to arrange her notes in chronological order. I paused, my hands trembling slightly, my throat tight. For years I had swallowed words like this, let criticism slide, and tried to remain invisible. But this time, something inside me hardened. "I'm careful because I care, and maybe if you let me finish, it will be better than doing it all yourself at the last minute." She stared at me, eyes wide, as if she hadn't expected resistance. Lucas, sitting across the room, snickered softly. My parents, in the living room, looked on, uncertain whether to intervene or remain silent. For the first time, I felt my voice carry weight, not because it was loud, but because it was honest. Vanessa's smirk faded, replaced with a flicker of irritation and perhaps recognition. The tension in the house escalated over the next few weeks. My small victories had made me visible, but visibility came with consequences. Vanessa became more competitive, trying to overshadow everything I did. Lucas, sensing the shift, increased his teasing, testing the boundaries of how far he could push me. One evening, my father asked me to help organize an important dinner for his business partners. I agreed, quietly planning every detail as I always did, but Vanessa interfered again, rearranging things to suit her tastes, laughing as though my work didn't matter. Lucas, ever the wild card, scattered a few decorative items just to watch my reaction. I felt frustration boiling beneath the surface, but instead of reacting angrily, I took a deep breath, reminded myself of the gala, and calmly readjusted the arrangements. I realized then that control wasn't about winning arguments, it was about resilience, patience, and strategy. Despite the ongoing conflicts, I discovered pockets of strength within myself. I began to understand that my siblings' loudness and charm were tools. They were not flaws, but ways of navigating the world. And my quiet nature, it was my own tool, just as powerful, though different. I started to plan my moments of visibility carefully, when to speak, when to act, when to step back and observe. I studied my siblings' reactions, my parents' moods, and the subtle cues that signaled opportunity. Slowly, I realized that even in a household that often overlooked me, I could assert my presence without confrontation. Yet the loneliness remained. Family dinners were still tense, holidays were still battlegrounds of subtle competition, and arguments continued to flare. But each challenge, each test made me stronger. I learned to navigate sarcasm, passive aggression, and rivalry with grace. I learned to take small victories and build upon them, to recognize my own value even when others refused to. During quiet moments, I would retreat to my room and reflect. The journals I kept became repositories of my thoughts, my frustrations, my hopes. I wrote about Vanessa's brilliance, Lucas's energy, my parents' expectations, and my own quiet determination. Writing became my way of reclaiming space, of asserting that I mattered even if no one else seemed to. By the time I was 17, I had developed a delicate equilibrium. I had learned when to speak, when to act, and when to wait. I had learned that family dynamics were complex, often unfair, but navigable. I had discovered that the house full of silence could also be a place of strategy, observation, and preparation. And yet, I sensed that the real test was yet to come. Recognition was no longer a novelty. My voice had been heard in glimpses, but could I sustain it? Could I claim my place in a household that seemed determined to define me by my quietness? Could I find the balance between family loyalty, personal growth, and self-respect? The answers were not immediate, but I felt a quiet confidence building inside me, a knowledge that though the rift between us might deepen at times, I had the strength to navigate it. I had learned to trust myself in small ways, to act deliberately, and to find meaning in subtle victories. And with that confidence came a sense of anticipation. The final year before leaving home was approaching, and with it, the opportunity to truly assert myself, not with rebellion, but with patience, intelligence, and courage. I knew that my journey was far from over, and that the next chapter would test everything I had learned. But for the first time, I was ready. By the time I turned 18, I had grown in ways I never thought possible. Years of quiet observation, careful patience, and subtle assertion had slowly shaped me into someone who understood both herself and the complex dynamics of my family. But understanding was only part of the journey. The next step was action, the act of fully claiming my space, my voice, and my identity. The house remained the same in structure, with its polished floors and grand chandeliers, but I no longer felt small within it. I had learned to navigate its halls with intention, to choose my moments of visibility carefully, and to protect my inner life with quiet determination. I had also learned that my voice, though gentle, could carry weight when used thoughtfully. It began with a simple act. My father asked me to plan the seating and dinner arrangements for an important corporate luncheon. I agreed immediately, not out of obligation, but because I knew this was another chance to assert myself. I spent days preparing every detail, studying the space, coordinating with staff, and ensuring that every place setting, every menu, and every decoration reflected care and elegance. Vanessa, predictably, wanted to interfere. "You're doing too much again," she said lightly, brushing past me as I adjusted a floral centerpiece. Lucas, sitting nearby, teased me, scattering napkins across the table just to see my reaction. But this time, I didn't flinch. I didn't let irritation or fear control me. I calmly restored the arrangements, smiled, and continued my work. I understood that asserting myself wasn't about confrontation, it was about persistence, quiet confidence, and deliberate action. When the luncheon began, I moved through the room observing discreetly. Guests were polite, smiling, commenting on the elegance of the tables. And then came the moment I had been quietly waiting for. My parents paused and looked around, their eyes settling on the arrangement with a mixture of pride and admiration. "Olivia," my mother said softly, almost in disbelief, "this is exceptional." I felt a warmth rise through me, a validation that wasn't dependent on loud praise or flamboyant gestures. Vanessa, for once, looked unsettled, not mocking, not competitive, but genuinely impressed. Lucas, surprisingly, nodded, a silent acknowledgement that I had done something remarkable. It was fleeting, yes, but it was mine. And for the first time, I realized something profound. I didn't need to be loud, flashy, or dramatic to be seen. I simply needed to act with intention and trust in my own abilities. The weeks that followed were transformative. I began to speak up more frequently at home, gently but firmly, expressing my thoughts. When Vanessa tried to dominate conversations, I found ways to interject calmly, with clarity and confidence. When Lucas teased or tried to draw attention away from me, I held my ground. And my parents, witnessing this steady growth, began to adjust their expectations, not suddenly, but gradually, as they recognized the person I was becoming. I also learned something essential about family. Love is rarely perfect, and recognition can be inconsistent. but relationships are built on persistence, patience, and understanding. I began to accept that my siblings, though often frustrating, were part of my journey, and that our differences could coexist without diminishing my worth. One evening, as I sat in my room reflecting on the past years, I wrote in my journal, "I am Olivia. I am capable. I am enough. I have learned that visibility is not given, it is claimed. I do not need permission to exist fully, to speak, to create, and to be seen. I am no longer invisible in my own life." Those words were not just a mantra, they were a declaration, a quiet, deliberate promise to myself that I would never again allow my value to be determined solely by others. The most profound change, however, was emotional. I began to reconcile with my family, not by ignoring past pain, but by understanding it. Vanessa and I found moments of genuine connection, small acknowledgments of mutual respect. Lucas, too, softened in his teasing, learning to include me in ways that felt playful rather than dismissive. And my parents, though still flawed in their understanding, began to see me, not just as the quiet middle child, but as a young woman with her own mind, heart, and voice. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. Family is messy, layered with love and frustration, rivalry and loyalty. But I realized that perfection wasn't the goal. Presence, authenticity, and courage were. As I prepared to leave home for the next chapter of my life, college, independence, and new experiences, I felt a sense of readiness I'd never known. I was no longer just the quiet observer, the invisible middle child. I was Olivia, a young woman who had navigated the complexities of family, discovered her voice, and learned to claim her place in the world. And in that moment, I understood a truth that had taken years to learn. Courage is not always loud, strength is not always visible, and the most important victories are often quiet, earned through patience, persistence, and self-belief. I closed the door of my room that night, took a deep breath, and smiled. I was ready, not for approval, not for recognition, but for life itself. The house remained the same, my siblings remained the same, my parents remained the same, but I had changed, and in that change, I had finally found myself.